Well, it's kind of a surreal version of Willie's life, which is surreal to begin with, you know, and a good-hearted movie.
Kris Kristofferson stood at the edge of the stage, like someone who had watched the horizon shift for a long time. He had the kind of tired patience that comes from decades on the road and from writing songs that people kept playing on jukeboxes and radios long after the bars emptied. When he spoke about country music, he did it in the plain, rough way he always had. No showy lines, no fake polish. He wanted listeners to hear a truth he thought had been buried under bright lights and hotel lobbies. He said what he meant without trying to dress it up, and the room leaned in. He began by telling a story about a small bar in Nashville where the jukebox once held a map of people's lives. People went there to leave pieces of themselves on stools and in songs. A weary truck driver, a hopeful waitress, a young man with a guitar, all of them were reflected in those songs. That music didn't try to be perfect. It celebrated mistakes and paid attention to ordinary pain. The songs carried a kind of weathered softness. They weren't polished like showroom cars. Kris remembered how those songs accumulated meaning simply because they named things plainly. Kris did not pretend the past was perfect. He knew country had always used the language of heartbreak and loss to sell records. But he argued that artists once used those themes to connect with people in a deep way. They wrote about real heartbreak and hard luck, not just glossy echoes of love and money. He believed songs should point a finger at something, even if it was just to say, "This hurts." The presence of truth, even when it was ugly, is what made those old songs stick in people's heads and in their lives. His first target was the rise of country pop, music that leaned harder on radio formulas and bright production than on the stories that used to sit at the center of the songs. He pointed to the way producers now pressed voices into a smooth, marketable sheen and layered them over tracks that could have fit equally well on a pop chart. He said it felt like swapping stories for decorations. It wasn't that pop elements never worked, it was that they had become a mask. Under that mask, he feared, the hard edges that gave songs their real feeling had been sanded away. Kris called out an era of artists who, in his view, treated country as a launching pad toward larger fame. He described the slow erosion when singers and songwriters made choices based not on the gut truth of a lyric, but on how many streams a hook could collect. The temptation to chase playlists and playlists' gatekeepers had pushed many songs toward a gentler, more anonymous place. He felt the sense of risk had gone missing. Where artists once bared an open wound, many now offered a friendly summary of life that left little to the imagination. He named 5 figures who, in his telling, symbolized the shift that had taken place. He did not attack them as people. Instead, he framed his critique around what their music had come to stand for, a trend away from grit and toward gloss. The first of these artists, he said, built a career on an image that blurred the line between country roads and corporate stages. He described how songs that once sketched small-town life had been reframed into big-budget fantasies, complete with stadium lights and products tied to a lifestyle. The stories now seem designed to sell a brand more than to hold a broken heart. The second artist, as Kris put it, helped fold rap and pop beats into country songs in a way that felt less like blending and more like borrowing. He admitted that music is always changing and that mixing styles could be exciting. Still, he argued that when the storytelling voice grows quiet and the beat grows loud, the listener's space to feel a song's meaning shrinks. Words lost weight, and hooks took over. The result, he said, was a crowd-pleasing kind of music that left listeners clapping, but not necessarily thinking. The third example he used was the superstar who seemed to treat country as a stepping stone. Early records wore the dust of genuine influence, he said, but later albums showed a turn toward sounds and collaborators that matched more with global charts than with local honky-tonks. Success changed the subjects the singer sang about. The small, urgent details gave way to themes that could travel overseas. Kris didn't attack the right to grow or to expand, but he mourned the loss of songs that spoke of particular people in particular towns. Fourth, He mentioned an act that embraced commercial-friendly production to the point that the record's texture often overpowered the message. Kris painted a picture of powerful refrains and glossy choruses that smoothed out the roughness of human voices and human stories. The music, he suggested, became a product to be consumed, rather than a mirror to reflect the listener's life. In bars and back roads, he argued, people prefer songs that rub shoulders with the messiness of living, not tunes that make the mess look neat. His last example was someone who turned country into a lifestyle package. Fashion, reality TV, and endorsements that created an entire persona separate from the songs. Kris didn't deny that a star could be many things, but he pointed out that when a musician's image starts to sell more clearly than the music itself, the songs can become packaging. The real risk, he said, is when the content of songs is set by marketing teams rather than by the messy, unpredictable urges that once sent singers to the page at dawn, wondering if truth might be found there. He did not glare at the artists personally. Instead, Kris focused on the industry mechanisms and the cultural hunger that encouraged them. He talked about managers, labels, and a streaming economy that prioritized short hooks and loud choruses. He described a system where the first 15 seconds of a track often decide its fate. That fact, he thought, compressed the story songs could tell. A ballad that needed time to breathe might not make the cut. The industry, he said, rewarded immediate payoffs over slow revelation. Kris also reflected on the role of radio. Once, he said, radio stations were curators that shepherded voices into homes, carefully choosing playlists that built relationships with listeners. Over time, radio's role shifted toward chasing ratings and advertisers. Playlists that fit a particular demographic became the rule. The songs that survived radio attention were often those that fit neat boxes. This move, he argued, made it harder for songs that were messy or hard to categorize to find an audience. He remembered songwriters who used to sit together in a room, swapping a verse and a chorus until something true emerged. That work was communal and slow and full of friction. Today, he said, songwriting sessions were sometimes reduced to co-writing in tight rooms with a formula in mind. The craft had become an assembly line in some quarters, with writers and producers aiming to hit a target rather than to uncover a strange, private truth. In Kris's telling, the stakes felt different. The goal was now a commodity. But his message wasn't only complaint. Kris held out hope for a future where country could regain its rawness without rejecting all new sounds. He believed artists could borrow rhythms or modern textures without giving up the worker's eye for detail that once marked the best songs. He suggested that the core of country, a commitment to clear, personal storytelling about ordinary lives, could live on, even if the instruments and production evolved. Kris urged listeners to be active in what they loved. If audiences pushed for songs that mattered, the industry would listen. He suggested that people seek out the small clubs, the late-night radio shows, and the streaming playlists that still cherished storytelling. Support local songwriters, buy records from independent labels, leave a tip for a busker who sings about real hard times. The change, he implied, would not come from executives, but from people who still wanted music to mean something. He also called on artists to remember the craft. When a young singer asked him how to keep a song honest, Kris gave a short piece of advice: stay awake while you write. He meant that literally and poetically. Stay attentive to the tiny truths that make a life. Don't reach too quickly for clever lines or crowd-pleasing phrases. Let a lyric sit in the quiet until it either proves itself or falls apart. That kind of patience, he believed, is where real songs begin. Many people in the room nodded when Kris spoke. Some felt a sting of guilt. They had bought glossier records and admired their shine. Others felt relieved that someone with his skinny, weathered voice was willing to name what many only felt. He did not pretend he had a solution that fit all cases. He offered instead a reminder that music is a living thing, and that living things respond to the care and attention given to them. Kris's list of 5 artists was less a hit list and more a mirror. He showed how success can change the work and how commercial pressure can reshape sounds. He did not wish misfortune on those artists. He wished for a return of the conditions that produced their best work. He believed that creativity thrives when it is allowed to be messy and when it must fight a little to survive. In the weeks after he spoke, conversations started in small corners of the music world. Songwriters at coffee shops debated what honesty in a lyric truly meant. A handful of new recordings arrived that traded some studio gloss for more exposed voices and simpler arrangements. A few radio hosts dared to play older songs between new tracks, reminding listeners of voices that had once been standard. None of this fixed anything overnight, but it nudged a larger conversation. Kris closed his remarks with a gentle warning and a small encouragement. He said that music does not belong to charts or awards. It belongs to the people who listen at 3 in the morning when the house is quiet and the past comes back curious. If country music could remember those lonely hours, it would remember how to tell stories again. He did not claim to save the genre. He only asked that the storytellers remember how to listen. Kris often returned to concrete moments that showed what he meant. He would tell of a night when a young woman sang a family song in a corner bar, and everyone quieted because the lyric named a small, painful thing: a father who left, a mortgage unpaid, a promise broken. That song did not have a radio-ready hook, but it had bodies in the room nodding as if the voice had turned the light on in a familiar house. Those were the songs that stayed with people for years, the ones that were sung again at funerals and at kitchen tables. He also talked about the dangerous convenience of modern success. A streaming playlist can make a career overnight, but it can also flatten a voice into a number. When a track is optimized to please an algorithm, layers of personal risk are often stripped away. He said that meant fewer moments where an artist might confess something true and messy. It meant fewer chances to surprise the listener with an odd, human line that doesn't try to please everybody. For Kris, surprise and risk were not accidents. They were the true work of songwriting. Kris shared memories of writers he respected, people who had nothing to lose and everything to say. He named no names in that list, but the faces were there. People he had met in shabby rooms in airports. People who wrote as if they were trying to make sense of life. Those writers wrote with an urgency that looked like courage. They put down lines that could slice or soothe. The craft was cultivated through nights of debate, through cigarettes and bad coffee, and through the long patience of waiting for a line that finally felt like someone had been found. He also admitted that change is part of music. Country had borrowed from blues, gospel, and folk for a long time. It was foolish to think the style could remain frozen, but Kris made a point. Borrowing is not the same as outsourcing. To borrow is to make something new from an old thing. To outsource is to hand the job to someone whose only task is to smooth edges and maximize plays. Where there was creative recombination, there could be growth. Where there was pure optimization, there was loss. Kris wanted a middle path. He believed artists could be ambitious and still rooted. They could write about stadium life and still remember a single porch light. They could use modern beats and keep a lyric that makes a listener look twice. He urged older singers to mentor the young, not by telling them to copy a past sound, but by teaching them how to hold a line until it proves itself. He urged younger artists to seek older ears for honest feedback. To him, mentorship was not about gatekeeping, but about keeping a craft alive. Finally, Kris emphasized the power of the listener. He thought people often underestimated how their choices shape culture. Each purchase, each playlist follow, each show ticket was a small vote. If listeners rewarded songs that told true stories, the industry would follow the money. If listeners made space for songs that risked being honest over songs that were merely pretty, the charts would eventually reflect that. He saw this as a practical way to protect the music he loved, not through nostalgia, but through careful choices. When he spoke, his voice was not angry so much as steady. He wanted to wake people up gently. He knew that art's evolution can be messy and that new voices bring needed perspectives. He did not ask for a return to some imagined purity. He simply asked that songwriters and listeners remember the most basic thing, that music matters because it remembers us. If country music could keep remembering, then it would keep being what it was always meant to be, a place where ordinary lives are turned into honest songs. His words did what real songs do. They stayed with people. They pushed some artists to think again about the kind of lyrics they wanted to leave behind. They pushed some listeners to look past the shine and find the songs that still told the truth. And months later, in bars and in small festivals, people heard voices that sounded less like products and more like weathered friends, which for Kris was the only kind of music worth putting on the road. Keep listening.